We continue the Varieties of Religious Experience, a study in human nature by William James, by starting with lectures 14 and 15, the value of saintliness. We now have passed in review the more important of the phenomena which are regarded as fruits of genuine religion. And characteristics of men who are devout. Today we have to change our attitude from that of description to that of appreciation. We have to ask whether the fruits in question can help us to judge the absolute value of what religion adds to human life. Were I to parody Kant, I should say that a critique of pure saintliness must be our theme. If, in turning to this theme, we could descend upon our subject from above like Catholic theologians, with our fixed definitions of man and man's perfection and our positive dogmas about God, we should have an easy time of it. Man's perfection would be the fulfillment of his end, and his end would be union with his Maker. That union would be pursued by him along the three paths, active, purgative, and contemplative, respectively, and progress along either path would be a simple matter to measure by. The application of a limited number of theological and moral conceptions and definitions, the absolute significance and value of any bit of religious experience we might hear of would thus be given almost mathematically into our hands. If convenience were everything, we ought now to grieve at finding ourselves cut off from so admirably convenient a method as this. But we did cut ourselves off from it deliberately in those remarks which you remember we made in our first lecture about the empirical method, and it must be confessed that after that act of renunciation, we can never hope for clean-cut and scholastic results. We cannot divide man sharply into an animal and rational part. We cannot distinguish natural from supernatural effects, nor among the latter know which are favors of God, and which are counterfeit operations of the demon. Well, demons, but like, for example, dreams. Yeah, sure, God created the natural order, but, there's three perpetrators of dreams, right? Most of them are really our own psychological stuff. We're processing what goes on during the day, at night, and all that. And then there is the divinely sanctioned dream, whether it's something, whatever sort of that thing that is, the true dream that would be called. And, well, I mean, I'm not saying that the third type that has demons, that they are going to completely lie to you, that there's a different sort of word for truth, right? But yeah, that third demonic source, but same thing goes with other spiritual experiences. I think the word is vision, not just dream, but we have merely to collect things together without any special a priori theological system, and out of an aggregate of piecemeal judgments as to the value of this and that experience, judgments in which in our general philosophic prejudices, our instincts, and our common sense are our only guides, decide that on the whole, one type of religion is approved by its fruits and another type condemned. Well, are the fruits the religion, or are the fruits the individual separate from the religion? That's something else to consider, right? On the whole, I fear we shall never escape complicity with that qualification, so dear to your practical man, so repugnant to your systematizer. I also fear that as I make this frank confession, I may seem to some of you to throw our compass overboard and to adopt caprice as our pilot. Skepticism, our wayward choice, you may think, can be the only results of such a formless method as I have taken up. A few remarks in depreciation of such an opinion, and in farther explanation of the empiricist principles which I profess, may therefore appear at this point to be in place. Abstractly, it would seem illogical to try to measure the worth of a religion's fruits in merely human terms of value. How can you measure their worth without considering whether the God really exists, who is superimposed to inspire them? If he really exists, then all the conduct instituted by men to meet his wants must necessarily be a reasonable fruit of his religion. It would be unreasonable only in case he did not exist. If, for instance, you were to condemn a religion of human or animal sacrifices by virtue of your subjective sentiments, and if all the while a deity were really there demanding such sacrifices, you would be making a theoretical mistake by tactically assuming that the deity must be non-existent. You would be setting up theology of your own as much as if you were a scholastic philosopher. And of course, anybody who doesn't take part in animal sacrifices and yet takes part in that other stuff, saying that they have some moral high ground because they don't take part in animal sacrifices when they take part in animal cruelty via their diet. I mean, to the extent of disbelieving peremptorily in certain types of deity, I frankly confess that we must be theologians. If disbeliefs can be said to constitute a theology, then the prejudices, instincts, and common sense which I have chosen as our guides make the theological partisans of us whenever they make certain beliefs abhorrent. But such common sense prejudices and instincts are themselves the fruit of an empirical evolution. Nothing is more striking than the secular alteration that goes on in the moral and religious tone of men as their insight into nature and their social arrangements progressively develop. After an interval of a few generations, the mental climate proves unfavorable to notions of the deity, which at an earlier date were perfectly satisfactory. The older gods have fallen below the common secular level and can no longer be believed in. Yeah, popularity and stuff really doesn't make a difference with that. Kind of makes a person a bit of a sociopath. They're deciding, oh no, that's if I worship that way, that's sort of unheard of. Yeah, no, make it about doing what's good or true or whatever. But today a deity who should require bleeding sacrifices to placate him would be too sanguinary to be taken seriously, even if powerful historical credentials were put forward in his favor. Didn't the early Christians practice animal sacrifice? We would not look at them. Once, on the contrary, his cruel appetites were of themselves credentials. They positively recommended him to men's imaginations in ages when such coarse signs of power were respected and no others could be understood. Or perhaps they just understood that better than we do now, and we've dropped off because we've lost understanding. Such deities then were worshipped because such fruits were relished. Doubtless historic accidents always played some later part, but the original factor in fixing the figure of the entities treated as gods and goddesses must always have been psychological. The deity to whom the prophets, seers, and devotees who founded the particular cult bore witness was worth something to them personally. They could use him. He guided their imagination, warranted their hopes, and controlled their will, or else they required him as a safeguard against the demon and a curber of other people's crimes. In any case, they chose him for the value of the fruits he seemed to them to yield. As soon as the fruits began to seem quite worthless, so soon as they conflicted with indispensable human ideals or thwarted too extensively other values. Nowadays, it's the rise of science that conflicts with conservative faith. By conservative, I mean the way of looking at it, not, So soon as they appeared childish, contemptible, or immoral when reflected upon, the deity grew discredited and was ere long neglected and forgotten. It was in this way that the Greek and Roman entities ceased to be believed in by educated people. It is thus that we ourselves judge of the Hindu, Buddhist, and Muslim theologies. Protestants have dealt with the Catholic notions of deity, and liberal Protestants with older Protestant notions. It is thus that Chinamen judge of us, and that all of us now living will be judged by our descendants, when we cease to admire or approve what the definition of a deity implies. We end by deeming that deity incredible. Few historic changes are more curious than these mutations of theological opinion. The monarchical type of sovereignty was, for example, so ineradicably planted in the mind of our own forefathers that a dose of cruelty and arbitrariness in their deity seems positively to have been required by their imagination. They called the cruelty retributive justice. Well, that doesn't have to be in the sense of cruelty, and a god without it would certainly have struck them as not sovereign enough. But today we abhor the very notion of eternal suffering inflicted, and that arbitrary dealing out of salvation and damnation to selected individuals, of which Jonathan Edwards, not the dude on the TV, well, I don't know if that show still exists, but anyways, there used to be a show. John Edwards. He stands in a circle and, does anybody have a dead relative with the letter F? You know, of which John Edwards could persuade himself that he had not only a conviction, but a delightful conviction, as of a doctrine exceeding pleasant, bright, and sweet appears to us, if sovereignly anything, sovereignly irrational and mean, not only the cruelty, but the paltriness of character of the entities believed in by earlier centuries also strikes later centuries with surprise. We shall see examples of it from the annals of Catholic saintship, which make us rub our Protestant eyes. Ritual worship in general appears to the modern transcendentalist, as well as to the ultra puritanic type of mind, as if addressed to a deity of an almost absurdly childish character, taking delight in toy shop, furniture, tapers, and tinsel, costume and mumbling and mummery, and finding his glory incomprehensibly enhanced thereby. Just as on the other hand a formless spaciousness of pantheism appears quite empty to ritualistic natures, and the gaunt theism of evangelical sects seems intolerably bald and chalky and bleak. Luther says Emerson would have cut off his right hand rather than nail his thesis to the door at Wittenberg, if he had supposed that they were destined to lead to the pale negations of Boston Unitarianism. So far, then, although we are compelled, whatever may be our pretensions to empiricism, to employ some sort of a standard of theological probability of our own whenever we assume to estimate the fruits of other men's religion. Yet this very standard has been begotten out of the drift of common life. It is the voice of human experience within us, judging and condemning all entities that stand athwart the pathway along which it feels itself to be advancing. A lot of what people call progressive is actually, regressive, but, and people say that's ahead of its time. That was something people were doing thousands of years ago. It's ahead of its, it's not. Experience, if we take it in the largest sense, is thus the parent of those disbeliefs which it was charged were inconsistent with experiential method. The inconsistency, you see, is immaterial, and the charge may be neglected. If we pass from disbeliefs to positive beliefs, it seems to me that there is not even a formal inconsistency to be laid against our method. The entities we stand by are thus entities we need and can use, the entities whose demands on us are reinforcements of our demands on ourselves and on one another. What I then propose to do, briefly stated, to test saintliness by common sense, is to use human standards to help us decide how far the religious life commends itself as an ideal kind of human activity. If it commends itself, then any theological beliefs that may inspire it in so far forth will stand accredited. If not, then they will be discredited, and all without reference to anything but human working principles. It is but the elimination of the humanely unfit and the survival of the humanely fittest applied to religious beliefs, and if we look at history candidly and without prejudice, we have to admit that no religion has ever in the long run established or proved itself in any other way. Religions have approved themselves. They have ministered to sundry vital needs which they found reigning. When they violated other needs too strongly, or when other faiths came which served the same needs better, the first religions were supplanted. The needs, well, the first, the conservative forms perhaps, the needs were always many, and the tests were never sharp. So the reproach of vagueness and subjectivity, and on the wholeness, which can, with perfect legitimacy, be addressed to the empirical method as we are forced to use it. It is, after all, a reproach to which the entire life of man in dealing with these matters is obnoxious. No religion has ever yet owed its prevalence to apodictic certainty. In a latter lecture, I will ask whether objective certainty can ever be added by theological reasoning to a religion that already empirically prevails. Now, you could say that there are faiths that aren't proven wrong, and then you have in any of their, or at least one that's not proven wrong in any of its cosmological claims, and therefore you can, with the other. And then you look at it pedagogically and say, well, it works in life, doesn't it? One word also about the reproach that in following this sort of an empirical method, we are handing ourselves over to systematic skepticism. Since it is impossible to deny secular alterations in our sentiments and needs, it would be absurd to affirm that one's own age of the world cannot be correction by the next age. Skepticism cannot, therefore, be ruled out by any set of thinkers as a possibility against which their conclusions are secure, and no empiricist ought to claim exception from this universal liability. But to admit one's liability to correction is one thing, and to embark upon a sea of wanton doubt is another. Of willfully playing into the hands of skepticism we cannot be accused. He who acknowledges the imperfectness of his instrument and makes allowance for it in discussing his observations is in a much better position for gaining truth than if he claimed his instrument to be infallible. Or is dogmatic or scholastic theology less doubted in point of fact, proclaiming as it does to be in point of right undoubtable? And if not, what command over truth would this kind of theology really lose if instead of absolute certainty she only claimed reasonable probability for her conclusions? If we claim only reasonable probability, it will be as much as men who love the truth can ever, at any given moment, hope to have within their grasp. Surely it will be more than we could have had if we were unconscious of our liability to err. Nevertheless, dogmaticism will doubtless continue to condemn us for this confession. The mere outward form of inalterable certainty is so precious to some minds that to renounce it explicitly is for them out of the question. They will claim it even where the facts most patently pronounce its folly. Now, as I said, sometimes it's the interpretations of the fundamentals that where the problem lies. And, one would be careful in some cases to do away with a religious claim per se and, look at, well, what does the base say? Does the base still support it? But the safe thing, surely, I can't figure out how to say that, but the safe thing is surely to recognize that all the insights of creatures of a day like ourselves must be provisional. The wisest of critics is an altering being, subject to the better insight of the morrow and right at any moment, only up to date. And, on the whole, when larger ranges of truth open, it is surely best to be able to open ourselves to their reception, unfettered by our previous pretensions. Heartily know, when half entities go, gods arrive. Okay, well, yeah, if there's one so-called divine way of thinking, that doesn't work, well, something else is there, right? Or will be there.